When you finally stop begging to be understood, stop chasing to be seen, and sit alone long enough to face the echo of your own silence, you realize that distance, responsibility, solitude, and self-stability were never punishments. They were the training ground for real strength, the place where dependency dies and authenticity is born. Distance exposes the self beneath performance. When people are constantly surrounded by validation, approval, or even conflict, they develop a kind of dependency on external input to define who they are. Every look, every reaction, every word from others becomes part of a mirror they stare into, trying to catch a glimpse of themselves. But the reflection is distorted. It's never truly them. It's a collage of what others expect, what they perform, and what they fear to lose. When that mirror is suddenly taken away, when distance enters the picture, something profound begins to happen. The silence becomes deafening, because it's the first time they've ever heard their own mind without the noise of the crowd. It's in that silence that the cracks begin to show. The person who was so quick to charm or to please or to dramatize begins to feel the absence of an audience as a kind of death. The persona they've built starts to crumble, because that persona was never designed to exist without feedback. It's like a play with no spectators. The lines lose their meaning, the gestures look absurd, and the actor suddenly realizes they don't know how to live off stage. Distance reveals that the performance was never the self. It was a desperate attempt to hide from the self. And yet, that revelation is painful beyond measure, because what's uncovered beneath performance isn't clarity right away, it's confusion. There's often shame, resentment, even terror. The individual realizes that most of what they've done wasn't born from genuine desire or conviction, but from a compulsive need to be seen, to be affirmed. The social self, that reactive creature constantly adjusting to the emotional weather of others, begins to starve. It thrashes around, searching for another hit of attention, but the silence doesn't feed it. It forces it to face withdrawal. And in that withdrawal, the truth emerges. What's revealed in distance is something raw and unfiltered. It's the unadorned reality of who you are when there's no one to impress, no one to manipulate, no one to please. The voice that arises there is quieter but truer. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't dramatize. It simply observes. It says, asterisk, this is what you've been avoiding. Asterisk, the shallowness of your pursuits, the fragility of your confidence, the constant performing to keep the anxiety at bay, all of it becomes clear. And that clarity, though brutal, is necessary. Because until you see what's false, you can't begin to find what's real. The distance strips away illusions layer by layer. It reveals how much of life has been built on performance rather than substance. Every smile that was forced, every word chosen to please, every argument crafted to win rather than to understand, they all lose their power in solitude. The only thing left is what's authentic, and often it's startling how little of that remains. But that little piece of truth, however small, becomes the foundation for rebuilding. It's honest, it's not polished, it's not strategic. It's you, stripped of everything that was borrowed or imitated, and it's in that place of emptiness that the possibility of growth begins. Most people run from this process. They interpret the discomfort of distance as punishment rather than revelation. They rush to fill it with distractions, new relationships, new drama, new attention, anything to avoid sitting still. But every escape only postpones the confrontation. Distance will find you again, and when it does, it will ask the same question it always asks. Asterisk, who are you when no one is watching? Asterisk, the longer one avoids answering, the more fragile one becomes, because identity built on external validation can't withstand solitude. It collapses under its own weight the moment it's not sustained by constant recognition. That collapse, though devastating, is the first real moment of honesty in a person's life. And honesty is the only soil where something genuine can grow. Attention addiction is avoidance of responsibility. The craving to be noticed, to be validated, to constantly exist in the gaze of others. It looks like a hunger for connection, but underneath, it's a refusal to grow up. When a person depends on attention to feel real, they are outsourcing their identity. They are saying, in effect, tell me who I am. Tell me I matter. It's easier to chase that fleeting recognition than to confront the hard truth that meaning isn't given, it's built. Attention provides a temporary illusion of importance, but it doesn't demand discipline, integrity, or sacrifice. Responsibility does. That's why attention feels so intoxicating and responsibility feels so heavy. One soothes insecurity, the other exposes it. People often mistake emotional intensity for authenticity. They believe that being expressive, dramatic, or endlessly visible is proof of aliveness. But in reality, that compulsion to be seen is often a mask for internal chaos. When you can't tolerate the quiet weight of being alone with your own inadequacies, you turn to the crowd for distraction. You generate noise because silence threatens to reveal how little structure there is within. Responsibility, by contrast, requires confronting that emptiness and beginning to order it. It means saying, I am accountable for who I become. That's a terrifying thought for someone whose identity has always been borrowed from reactions. Attention demands nothing except performance. Responsibility demands transformation. This is why people addicted to attention resist boundaries. Boundaries imply ownership of one's emotions, one's time, one's choices. They imply saying no, withdrawing from the crowd, and taking stock of one's actions. But attention addiction thrives on permeability, on the endless interchange between self and others, where nothing is grounded and everything is reactive. In that environment, responsibility feels like suffocation. It's far easier to say, they made me feel this way, than to say, I let this happen because I refuse to discipline myself. The former keeps you in motion, constantly blaming and emoting. The latter freezes you in place and forces you to see your reflection without distortion. There's a cruel irony to attention seeking. It feels empowering in the moment, but it's profoundly enslaving. The more attention you receive, the more you need it. The applause becomes your oxygen, and soon you can't breathe without it. Every post, every reaction, every conversation turns into a subtle transaction. Feed me, validate me, prove that I still exist. But each hit of validation makes the hunger worse, not better, because it reinforces the underlying avoidance. You're not building yourself, you're renting your self-image from the crowd. And when the crowd moves on, you collapse. Responsibility breaks that cycle. It says stop performing, start producing. It calls for order where there was chaos, for commitment where there was convenience. It forces you to replace the short-term pleasure of attention with the long-term pain of discipline. But that pain, paradoxically, is what eventually brings peace. Because once you stop relying on attention to define you, you begin to realize that responsibility is not a burden, it's the only form of freedom that's real. Solitude transforms emotional dependency into strength. When someone is constantly surrounded by others, they begin to draw their emotional energy from the external world. They need affirmation, conversation, touch, and approval just to feel stable. It's not connection, it's dependency disguised as warmth. The idea of solitude terrifies them because it removes the scaffolding that keeps their fragile sense of self upright. But when solitude is embraced rather than feared, it becomes the forge where independence is shaped. It strips away the illusion that peace comes from others and reveals that stability can only come from within. At first, solitude feels like withdrawal. The silence presses in, and every insecurity rises to the surface. You notice the restlessness that company used to drown out. You hear the anxious chatter in your mind, that constant distraction once silenced. This is where transformation begins, not through comfort but through confrontation. When you sit long enough in solitude, you start to see your emotional patterns with painful clarity. The neediness, the constant reaching outward, the compulsion to be noticed, they all become visible. You start to realize that much of what you thought was connection was actually an attempt to fill a void that could never be filled by others. Solitude teaches emotional containment. You begin to hold your own feelings instead of projecting them. You start to process sadness without performing it, to feel anger without spilling it onto someone else, to find joy without demanding that others validate it. Each time you do this, a small thread of inner strength is woven. Over time, those threads form something solid, a groundedness that no amount of external approval can imitate. The more you practice this containment, the more you begin to see that solitude isn't isolation, it's integration. It's the place where scattered emotional fragments begin to form a whole. People often confuse solitude with loneliness because they've never experienced being alone without being abandoned. But solitude is chosen. It's deliberate separation for the sake of inner alignment. Loneliness says, no one sees me. Solitude says, I see myself. In that distinction lies the beginning of strength. You start to discover what sustains you when nothing external is feeding you. You learn that your mind, when disciplined, can be your greatest companion rather than your enemy. You learn to build routines, rituals, and reflections that give meaning to your time alone. The emptiness turns into structure. The silence becomes music. Through solitude, you discover that emotional independence isn't cold detachment. It's warmth that doesn't demand to be returned. It's love that isn't desperate for recognition. It's confidence that doesn't depend on applause. When you reach this point, relationships stop being transactions for emotional survival and start becoming expressions of abundance. You give rather than grasp. You listen rather than perform. You connect without clinging. The paradox is that solitude, the very thing you once thought would destroy you, becomes the source of your greatest strength, because it's where you finally learn to belong to yourself. Distance is not rejection, it's a call to maturity. Most people interpret distance as a personal insult, as if the universe or another person has withdrawn affection as a punishment. But distance often comes when you're not ready to see something about yourself. It's a pause, not a punishment. When someone steps back, when a door closes, when silence replaces conversation, it's easy to react with panic and self-pity. You tell yourself stories about being abandoned or unworthy. Yet beneath that reaction is an invitation, a challenge to grow past the need for constant reassurance. Maturity begins when you stop demanding that others soothe your insecurity and start learning to face it yourself. Distance reveals what kind of attachment you've built. If your self-worth collapses when someone withdraws, it wasn't built on truth, it was built on dependency. The mature person learns to interpret distance differently. Instead of rushing to close the gap, they ask, what is this space trying to show me? Maybe it's showing you that you've been too reliant on external validation. Maybe it's revealing your inability to tolerate uncertainty. Maybe it's highlighting how quickly you confuse attention with love. Every form of distance teaches something if you stop trying to erase it long enough to listen. Maturity means standing still in the discomfort of that lesson. It means not chasing after people or circumstances to restore your sense of control. It means letting the silence do its work. Because silence has a way of magnifying truth. It makes clear where your boundaries are weak, where your expectations are unrealistic, where your emotions have been running unchecked. When distance appears, immature people rush to fill it with noise, messages, explanations, or guilt. Mature people learn to wait. They let the gap breathe. In that stillness, they rediscover something fundamental, the ability to exist without constant reassurance that they matter. This shift is painful because it dismantles illusions of permanence. It shows you that love, friendship, and even purpose are not guaranteed. They must be nurtured, not demanded. It forces you to develop emotional stamina, the ability to remain composed even when everything familiar feels far away. That composure is not indifference, it's strength. It's what allows you to act with integrity rather than desperation. When you no longer interpret distance as proof of rejection, you stop living reactively. You begin to see that sometimes distance is how reality tests your readiness for deeper connection. Every meaningful relationship, whether personal or professional, will go through periods of distance. The immature panic, the mature reflect. One tries to pull the other closer by force, the other allows time to clarify what's real. That's the difference between attachment and understanding. Distance, when accepted, cultivates emotional precision. It teaches patience, humility, and discernment. It forces you to build inner equilibrium so that closeness, when it returns, is no longer a desperate need but a mutual choice. In that choice, maturity is born. True connection is earned through self-stability. Real closeness isn't something that can be forced, begged for, or constantly maintained through emotional manipulation. It arises when two people stand firmly as individuals and choose to meet without losing themselves in the process. When someone lacks self-stability, every relationship becomes a balancing act built on anxiety. They cling, they overanalyze, they perform, all in an effort to keep the bond alive. But real connection doesn't need to be held together by desperation. It's sustained by groundedness, by the ability to remain whole even when the other person steps back. Self-stability means you've confronted your own chaos. You know where your emotions end and another person's begin. You can handle silence without assuming it means rejection. And you can give without keeping score. This doesn't happen by accident. It comes from years of internal work, learning to regulate your feelings, to recognize your projections, to find calm in uncertainty. Most people want intimacy without doing this groundwork. They chase connection because they want someone else to complete them, to validate their worth, to make life meaningful. But that kind of connection always collapses under pressure because it's built on dependency, not choice. When you are stable within yourself, relationships take on a different texture. You stop seeking ownership and start seeking understanding. You don't demand constant reassurance because your sense of worth isn't borrowed from someone else's opinion. You give space because you no longer see distance as danger. This stability allows for honesty. It allows people to speak freely, to disagree, to step away without fear of emotional collapse. The irony is that the more secure you are within yourself, the deeper your connections become. People trust those who are calm, not those who are constantly grasping. They gravitate toward presence, not performance. Self-stability also means taking responsibility for your inner life. If this message resonates, don't run from the silence. Step into it. Let distance teach you, let solitude shape you, and let responsibility refine you. Start today. Withdraw from the noise for just 1 hour. Sit with yourself and listen. That's where the real transformation begins.